Women make up almost half of the world's farmers, and in Malawi, women are quite literally the backbone of the rural economy. Many women are sidelined, however, when it comes to owning assets, such as land. Yet when there is poverty and hunger in the household, women are the ones who suffer most because they usually look after the family and children. They are the human link between the farm and the table, and it is very painful when a woman sees her children suffer from hunger. In the northern district of Chitipa, this is what a group of 13 women from Mwanga village had been experiencing for years due to repeatedly low harvests from conventional farming. Mwanga village, situated at the foot of Mafinga Hills on the border of Malawi and Zambia, is very isolated from government extension services and other support. These women were unable to access extension services until they met T&E field staff. They could not afford to feed their families 3 meals a day because of these poor harvests and witnessed their children suffering from malnutrition. After attending a field day conducted in the Lufita area organized by T&E lead farmers, the women decided to adopt deep-bed farming. The chairlady, Dinus, and members of this group vowed to improve their lives and the lives of their children, ending hunger and poverty in their households. In order to understand, they asked for technical advice from T&E staff. It was only then that T&E became aware and arranged to meet this group. It was amazing to see all 13 women had already tilled a 1/4 acre each. T&E staff responded quickly and conducted deep-bed farming training right away, and it was then that they discovered that most of the women represent female-headed households. Dinus and her group have adopted the motto, ending hunger and poverty through deep-bed farming. After adopting deep-bed farming, they are optimistic that this season they will harvest a high yield from their fields this year and increase the meals per day and nutritional status of their children. The group is planning to expand their fields later in 2021 so they can grow enough surplus food to sell. With the income, they plan to start a village bank, buy iron roof sheets to upgrade their existing thatch houses at a cost of $100 per house, pay secondary school fees for their children at $13 per semester, and buy mobile phones as one further way of improving access to information and markets. All of this is achievable and more with the income increase deep-bed farming can quickly provide to farmers. As the global community works towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, women like the Mwanga Group can be key agents of change in agriculture, nutrition, and rural development. This group of 13 has already managed to train 80 other households in Mwanga Village to regenerate their land through farming. T&E regards women as key agents in ending hunger and poverty in their communities. Women need all the support we can give them to achieve this goal.
On behalf of all of us at the Soil Food Web School, thank you for supporting T&E. I am proud to be a part of an organization that supports the T&E Fund, and I've personally donated $50 because I know that all of that will go to T&E, and it will all go towards helping one farmer train for life in the deep bed method, and that the deep bed method works with the landscape so that when heavy rains come, and it does not wash away all of that compacted soil into the lakes and rivers, and instead retains the water so that it can slowly percolate into that deep, rich soil. And coming to you to talk about water slowly moving across the landscape and sinking in to help our plants grow strong and fortified, I am thrilled to introduce Zach Weiss, founder and president of Elemental Ecosystems. Zach trained with the revolutionary Austrian farmer Sepp Holzer and learned how using natural materials and seasonal rainfall, how to read the land like time. By slowing water down as it flows across the landscape, Zach engages in a reciprocity with the land. I appreciate that he's not only able to imagine how he can have a positive impact, but he's already doing it. And as you'll see, his projects are amazing. I got to see one of his projects when I was training as a consultant training program mentor by Nick Tomasini up here in Portland, Oregon. One of our soil food web trained consultants showed me around his farm that was also working with Zach to do the series of water features to allow all of the water to penetrate deeper across the land. I give you Zach Weiss.
Greetings, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be speaking with you all who are really concerned about the soil and the health of our planet. I'm going to be speaking today about restoring our water cycle and how it can regenerate the earth. So there's three big takeaways from today. There's the full water cycle, why this is something that's really important to life on our planet and why it's something that we should start working with. The watershed death spiral, why that's a trajectory we've been on for the past several thousand years, and it's something we should really change course from. And water, and how it is Earth's blood. And if you look around the world, you don't have to look far to see how the architecture of the Earth mirrors our own architecture of our own bodies. And in the rivers, creeks, and streams, they're much like our veins, returning that water back to the circulation system. But it's not just these rivers, creeks, and meandering water forms, but also the trees and the atmospheric water that also function like our body. The trees are really acting as the lungs of the planet, driving this atmospheric water in both the large water cycle and the small water cycle. So they're really playing a critical role in this system that's called the biotic pump. And so this is the full water cycle. Water evaporates off the ocean, and then that humid air drifts inland. In order for that water vapor to condense and form clouds and then rain, it needs a nuclei to form around. High up in the mountains and with orographic lift, some of these nuclei are ice crystals. As that water freezes, the other water droplets coalesce around it. In deserts and in certain environments, it's actually salts that drive this. But for the vast majority of the world, it's hygroscopic microorganisms. These are microorganisms produced in the stomatal cavity of trees that then are hygroscopic, so they attract this water vapor into droplets that then form clouds and eventually rain. As this water vapor undergoes a phase change and becomes liquid, it goes from very voluminous to very small. And that creates a vortex. And so that low pressure created through that process then draws in more humidity from the coast. And so in this way, it's a conveyor belt drawing moisture from the oceans inland. Then that water, as it falls in the full water cycle, it's falling on rich, shaded, vegetated earth that's cool. And in that cool, open, porous earth, the water infiltrates rapidly into the soil, and this recharges the earth's body. This water moves through the earth body and eventually feeds springs and creeks and rivers, keeping them cool, oxygen-rich, and full of life throughout the year. This also recharges our underground aquifers and works its way back slowly to the ocean. So there's the big water cycle, moving water from the ocean inland and back again, but there's also the small water cycle. And on average, 50% of our rainfall actually comes from the small water cycle, water that's evaporated or transpired by trees in place and condenses and falls as rain within that same location. So it's the big water cycle and the small water cycle, both together make up our rainfall. And this drives a system called the biotic pump, which provides consistent moisture throughout the year in a way that the land can really absorb and benefit from it. This is a tree called Big Mama. It was alive on Turtle Island before Columbus ever arrived. And when this tree was young, you could drink from any body of water in the Americas. Under indigenous stewardship, they had reverence and love and appreciation for the water and for nature, and they stewarded this resource. So any stream, any body of water, any river was clear, clean, healthy water that you could drink. Now in Minnesota, the land of 1,000 lakes, the state found that no lake met the state's quality standards for fishable or swimmable. And so we've gone from drinkable water everywhere to entire regions where no lake is even fishable or swimmable. This is a really big travesty, and it's happened in a short period of time. And in our Western cultures, we really lack an appreciation for the intuitive knowing that comes from existing in stewardship with the landscape. This is what indigenous cultures around the world have had for a long time. And so it was common knowledge among indigenous cultures that the forests and the trees actually drive the rainfall and that they bring the rain. Western science thought, oh no, these silly natives, they don't understand what's going on. The forests grow in regions where there's lots of rainfall, and that's why they think this. But now, as we get advanced enough to actually catch up to these indigenous ways of knowing, we're learning that forests actually do drive the rainfall. With these microscopic organisms, they're driving between 40 and 80% of the rainfall, depending on which climate you're in. So they're really playing a key role in this cycling of water through the planet. This is the half water cycle. Many different people have looked at this different ways. Victor Schauberger looked at it as the full and the half water cycle. This I also call the watershed death spiral because it's something that really leads to a bad, scary result. And so in this situation, humans come through and we clear all the forests and we monetize that value. We build roads, we build cities, we drain the wetlands because that's where the best soils are. And so we slowly dehydrate the landscape for monetary value. What this creates is a lot of open, bare ground, and the temperature of the soil heats up. Now, if you imagine that soil being like a sponge, when a sponge is totally dry and hot, it can't even absorb the water when it first hits it. It actually needs to cool down and loosen up to be able to hold that water. And so like a dry sponge in this situation, when the rain does come, it all runs downhill quickly, leading to flooding and erosion. But because all of that water was drained away instead of infiltrated into the ground, it also leads to drought, and then it leads to fires as well. All the while, the water table is sinking, the water quality is declining. And so humans, in our knowledge, we drill into the groundwater and we bring out that water for crops, only further increasing the rate and intensity of desertification that we experience. Eventually, the water fails, the aquifers fail, the crops fail, and you end up with this situation that's really dire. Not just that, but now you have all this open, exposed ground, especially along the coast where many of the world's cities are. On that hot ground, it heats up and it forms a high pressure dome. Now, this low pressure system on the oceans, as the sun evaporates that water, it tries to come inland, but with that hot air pushing back, it doesn't allow it to enter. The low pressure can't move into a zone of high pressure. And so what happens is the pressure on the coast builds until the pressure is so great that eventually it overwhelms anyway. And so you get these huge cloudburst rain events that lead to horrific flooding, but then with long periods of drought in between. And so this is leading to all of these so-called natural disasters that we experience. They're not natural, they're actually the result of the watershed death spiral. And so we can look around the world at some of these different veins and parts of the earth, and we can start to understand what's happened. This is the Fertile Crescent, the Levant, the birthplace of agriculture. At one point, this was one of the most productive river basins in the world. 10,000 years ago, humans invented the plow and they domesticated animals, and they started really changing how they managed the landscape. They now had these two new tools to remove vegetation and keep vegetation off the landscape. What that did over time is it broke down that moisture conveyor belt. And now in this region that used to be one of the most productive in the world, it's this hot, humid desert because we've broken that precipitation cycle. We don't have the vegetation to create the hygroscopic microorganisms to create the rainfall. And so now we have these hot, humid hazes warming up these places, instead of the cooling rains that used to provide life to these places. Now, as you move through history, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 years ago, these strategies and colonization reached the Sahara and desertified that landscape. So these same land practices and that same destruction of the vegetation and dehydration of the landscape has led to this desertification. Now we look at the Tibetan Plateau, an area that's been contiguously inhabited by humans for 20,000 years, yet 6,000 years ago, when the plow and domesticated animals came to the region, that's when the desertification occurred. And so they know this from sediment core samples within lakes that have pollen of trees that can't exist there now because of the rainfall they receive that were there within recent antiquity. And so it's these land management practices that are actually making a change in the water cycle. They're breaking both the small and the large water cycle, draining water out of the small water cycle to the oceans, and then preventing that water from returning in a way that can be absorbed in the big water cycle, leading to this desertification. And over the last 10,000 years, humans have done this to 1/3 of the entire Earth. That's really a staggering figure when you matter. That's a pretty short period of time to desertify such a huge portion of the Earth. And you can look through our different philosophers. This is more than 2,000 years ago, Plato talking about how the land in Greece used to be the best in the world, but now there are only the bones of the wasted body remaining, all the richer and softer parts having fallen away and a mere skeleton being left. In the primitive state of the country, its mountains were full and covered with rich soil, and the plains full of rich earth. There was an abundance of wood in the mountains, but now only the traces of this remain, and the mountains only afford sustenance to bees. In the past, the land reaped the benefit of the annual rainfall, not as now, losing the water which flows off the bare earth into the sea, but having an abundant supply in all places, providing everywhere abundant fountains and rivers. And hopefully this sounds really familiar because that's speaking about the full water cycle and then our shift to the half water cycle. But what's really interesting to me is in this last phrase, he speaks about how the landscape used to be cultivated by lovers of honor and a noble nature, with the soil the best in the world, an abundance of water, and in the heaven above, an excellently attempered climate. And so this is Plato more than 2,400 years ago, drawing the connection between the water cycle, the health of the landscape, and the climate. And what's really scary to me is we're getting better at this. You can see this desertification from just the plow and the animal, but now we're making these concrete metropolises that all drain the water away even better than before. We're making these huge road systems, cities, developments, building in wetlands, all of these things that are further desiccating the landscape at an even more effective means and at a faster rate. This is Bogota, but it could really be almost any city in the world. And you see everything in the city is designed to drain the water away as quickly as possible. But it's not just that. This city is in the bottom of a valley. And so in the past, that assuredly was a landscape rich of water and vegetation. But now it's all draining away, and all of the mountains feed their water to that area. So it's not just draining the water that hits the city, but all of the water that hits the surrounding landscape that used to infiltrate in this valley is being drained away as well. And what's that leading to? It's leading to horrific flooding downstream. But then because all of that water is being drained away, it's leading to horrific droughts all around the world, seemingly every year more prevalent and more severe. And then in the worst cases, it's leading to fire. And you get the last little bits of vegetation, instead of being food for fungi, they become food for fire. And you're left with a landscape of ashes in what used to be a rich, vegetated, healthy landscape. And this is leading to huge issues in human quality of life: starvation crises, water insecurity, food insecurity, refugees, and even war and death. And all of these things actually come from a structural problem in the way that we manage and receive our water. And so this is the watershed death spiral. It's not just a death spiral for life, but it's a death spiral for humans. You look at a situation like Syria, that is the result of the watershed death spiral. And then you can look at a situation like California and see how that's really close to Syria. And in the near future, if we don't change our practices, that same kind of catastrophe is going to happen. This is a hygrograph. This is looking at our water flow through the landscape over time and with two different situations. In the red, it's important to note these are both the same volume of water, but how long they persist in the landscape. So in the red, we have the concreted landscape. We have a hot temperature, we have a high bulk density, and we have a low carbon count. And so on this landscape, all of the rain comes and it all drains away. And you get huge flooding, short period of time, and then no water. So that also means you're not getting any photosynthetic growth, which is driving this whole process of cooling the planet, but also driving those moisture cycles, creating low pressure systems that then draw in more moisture from the coast. In the other scenario, you have the rich vegetated landscape, forests, plains, wetlands. That's a low temperature because it's shaded and protected from the sun. It's a low bulk density and it's a high percentage carbon because it's a rich, friable soil full of fungi, full of life. And in this, there's still some runoff in this landscape, but much less because that moisture is able to infiltrate into the ground. What you also get is now that moisture moves through the system for an incredible amount of time because you have that hydrotension on the water with the soil, allowing it to slowly move downhill. And so with this situation, you have green photosynthetic growth year round. You have trees cooling the air 590 calories per gram of water that they transpire. And so you have this consistent growth, you have consistent vegetation, consistent farm productivity, or you have this narrow window when it all happens, and then you have desert for the rest of the year. Now, in the red scenario, you're designing the flood. You're actually creating landscapes that flood. And so you have the erosion from that flood, you have the risk from the flood waters, you have the cost to repair that, you have the insurance to cover the costs, and then you have the finance charges on all of that because you can't afford any of it. But not just that, because you're designing the flood, you're also designing the next drought and the next fire. And so you have the erosion from that event and the risk and the cost and the insurance and the finance. And it's creating a situation that's just not viable for land stewards and farmers alike. This is what that graph looks like in reality. This is Mannahatta, or Manhattan, New York, under indigenous stewardship on the left and under colonial stewardship on the right. In this worldview on the left, everything on the earth, in the sky, in the ground is sacred. It has a role to play. It has a purpose, and it's interconnected. And the surrounding world is regarded with love and respect. In the worldview, in the colonial system, everything has energy in order to be extracted so that that wealth can be accumulated to a small portion of people. And this really comes from the monarch. And it's amazing to me that they've brainwashed so much of the world to extract not only the energy from the landscapes that they love and participate in, but the energy from themselves, all for the interests of the greed of a handful of people. So this is my mentor, Sepp Holzer, and he really taught me so many things, but first and foremost, that nature is our teacher and guide. And all of our questions, nature has an answer for. And if there's a situation that arises that's a problem, nature is perfect. So the problem can't be on nature's side. The problem has to be on the human side. And so how do we create systems that really work with nature in a symbiotic manner? And around the world, he's done really incredible things to rehydrate, revegetate, and revitalize landscapes. This is the Tamara Peace Research Center in Portugal. It was a community that was struggling with water for their community, didn't have enough for any kind of agriculture. And they came to Sepp and said, can we survive here? Is this a place where we can continue to inhabit? And so in this same place, this is the landscape that now exists. Now, really important, this is only with the rain from the sky. This is using that year-round moisture and infiltrating it into the landscape, returning it to the ground. Now, really interesting, when they were building this, all the neighbors were against it. They said, you're stealing our water. And in this area in Portugal, they get essentially 1 month of heavy rainfall and 11 months of drought. Now the neighbors love this because instead of 1 month of flooding and 11 months of drought, they have steady year-round springs fed by this retention landscape. And so by actually returning that water to the landscape, you're making it more available for all of Earth's inhabitants. And so this is Sepp's original farm, the Krameterhof, a really amazing example of what can be achieved when people work with nature. It's this high mountainside farm that's supposed to be too steep, too cold, too hard to do anything. Yet they created this abundant oasis, almost like an Eden on a mountainside, of 72 interconnected ponds and water bodies and a rich agroforestry system that works with nature to produce food, medicine, income, and everything that you need to exist within the planet in a meaningful sense. And what they've done first and foremost is learned how to work with nature. So as conventional farmers grow one crop and they're all dependent on that crop, the Krameterhof takes a totally different approach. They grow many crops every year, grown within an interconnected ecosystem, and they harvest the ones that do really good that year or that fetch a really good price at market that year. So here's a situation where they're growing fungi on logs underneath cherry trees. And so in a really dry year, the fungi aren't going to be producing much. They're not going to be doing good. And so they don't even bother harvesting them because in a dry year, the cherries fetch an exceptional value for schnapps making and they're of an exceptional quality. So they put all of their time and effort into harvesting the cherries and let the fungi live for another year. Now, conversely, if it's a really wet year, the cherries are going to be splitting and molding. There's going to be a low price. They're going to be hard to deal with. They don't bother trying to work through that process because the fungi are having a bumper crop that year because it's very humid. And so when you work with nature, you start to learn that every year is a different blessing in its own way. Instead of complaining that it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too dry, it's too wet, farmers are always complaining about the weather. With this method of farming, whatever happens, it's a blessing because something has really done exceptionally well. This is the first project I worked on with Sepp. This is a heavily degraded wetland where the previous owner built an airstrip through the wetland. And what we did in short order is turn this into this ecological oasis where you can now see tracks of every kind of wildlife in Montana that's producing an immense amount of vegetation and food, geese and turtles breeding in the water. It's just an incredible turnaround. And this was just done in 11 days. You know, we really can make a huge impact in a short period of time when we put our effort into the right place, when we put our efforts into water. And so these are really strategies to rehydrate the landscape. This is that first scenario I was talking about in Portugal. Here, they had a road that was dehydrated in the landscape that they then turned into a dam, a retention feature to rehydrate the landscape. And so you can see here how they rerouted that road and really made it something that benefits the landscape and themselves instead of something that's continually degrading it. And what's really important is that this is not just holding water in a pond or with a liner, but this is actually returning water to the earth. We're only creating a barrier layer on the downhill side. So here is a dam, another project in the Extremadura in Spain. This is a place that's 45 degrees Celsius and blowing hot winds in the summer. People said you could never create a water body, but yet they created this oasis in the desert by working with the landscape. And so here you can really see on the downhill side, they have the dam holding the water back, But on the uphill side and all around, that water actually feeds into the landscape. And so here you see all that green grass because the feature is not just holding the water in the water body itself, it's holding it in the Earth's body. So that all the way uphill at those same elevations, it's actually holding that water as well. This really reduces your evaporative losses, but it really enhances that recharge of the aquifers and of the earth. And so when people talk about their environmental footprint, it's always about how to have a smaller environmental footprint, how to do less bad. I want to have the largest environmental footprint possible because I know we can have a positive footprint. And if we're only ever talking about having a less negative footprint, we're always going to have a negative footprint because we're not doing anything positive. What we need to do is start finding the things that are a yes, the things that we believe in, the things that we want to exist in this world, and create those. And so we're using machines, we're using fossil fuel energy, we're using the tools we have available to us today in order to create a really positive footprint for ourselves and for future generations. This is another mentor of mine, Rajinder Singh, the waterman of India. And when you look at having a positive footprint, he's the perfect example. When he came to this region in India, the people were really struggling. The people in the village were struggling from the night blindness, from malnutrition, and he was a doctor trying to treat these people. And an old man that he was actually able to cure, one of the few that he was able to help, said, "Rajindra, what did you do to me? When I was blind, people filled my port with water. Now I need to go fetch my own water. If you want to help us, we don't need medicine, we need water." And so this old man, Manukaka, took Rajindra into the wells and showed him the geological layers. He showed him the traditional ways of managing water through these johads on the landscape, and he showed him where to start. And so Rajindra started by himself as a doctor, everyone making fun of him, using a shovel and a pick to restore this water body. Now downstream, later on after the monsoons, when that well was recharged with water because of that johad upstream of it, the people started to realize that there was something really important going on here, and they really started to join him and they started to help him. And it created this whole movement in India that's created a tremendous impact. So this is just one of their projects. This is in the Kairoli district, an area that was really struggling. The farmers were failing. They had no water. They drilled 27 borehole wells. They were all dry and they were out of options. And so for the same price as that 27 boreholes, they built this one large reservoir. And what that did is it gave the community water. It gave the community life. You can see the difference in this landscape from brown to green, from desert to lush. And what this facilitated is they went from 9 hectares of agriculture to over 650. They paid for the cost of the water feature 4 times over the first year in their increase in agricultural productivity. And it's made life in this village viable again. So now people are coming back to help work the farms and move out of the cities. And so through this movement, over 35 years, they've actually restored 7 rivers to perennial flow. They've brought water back to 250,000 wells, impacting 1 million people, causing reverse migration from the cities back to the landscapes. They've gone from 2% greenery to 48% greenery in this portion of Rajasthan, and they've lowered the temperature 2 degrees Celsius. This is climate change action in practice. This is restoring our water cycle in practice, and this is creating a viable, livable future for future generations. And so now this community doesn't just have that water for 1 year. As long as they maintain these systems, it has that water forever. And so now they've given this gift to future generations that as long as they maintain it and keep up with it, they will always have. And in India, when there's not enough water, the woman of the household spends her time getting water. If she doesn't have enough time, the female children stay home to help get the water. And so in this region, you had this situation where all of the females were working for the household, and none of them going to school, none of them getting an education that then facilitates later things in life. Now they've brought water back to this region. And so the female children are now going to school again. And so very quickly, a water issue becomes a gender equality issue. And you start to see how one little change in the bottom of the whole web of life, which is water, starts to create ripple effects through the rest of that web. And the more I learn, the more important I realize it is that water is a common good, and the privatization of water is criminal, and it really should be prosecuted as such. You don't need to go any further than Australia to see the results of a privatized water supply. There, they have a scenario where the indigenous communities haven't had their rivers flow for 3 years now. You have fish flopping around dying in a dry riverbed while people are making huge sums of money by artificially increasing the price of the water. Farmers are actually wasting water so that they use their full water rights and hold them for the future, and also so that they inflate the price of the water that they are selling. When you put these basic common good resources in the hands of bankers, they manage them to make money, not for the common good. And the way to make money is with forced scarcity. So if you create scarcity of these resources, you can make a lot of profits, but you actually reduce the value of the landscape. You reduce your fundamental asset, which is really a travesty. And so we need to urgently come together as a people and to say that water is a common good and water has rights, and the privatization of water is not going to be allowed. We're not going to tolerate it. And it's really important that as a people, we come together in this overregulated world and say, we as a people are taking control of our own land and our own water to steward it in the means for ourselves and for future generations. For example, in India, there were 73 legal cases against Rajinder, this man that brought water to millions of people. They wanted to put him in jail because it's about decentralized water systems. When water systems are decentralized, you can't monetize them. So by creating all of these johads, they were creating water independent communities that no longer needed to buy their water. And so water wasn't going to the big dams and reservoirs and wasn't able to be sold later. And so the governments have a huge issue with this. But it's really important that we at this time stand together as people and fight this. You know, we're seeing for the first time water futures being traded on Wall Street. If we tolerate this, we are headed towards a Mad Max future where wars are fought over water, where there's world wars over water. And it's just for the artificial scarcity and profit making of some greedy people. Nature is prolific by nature. The landscape wants to come alive as soon as you bring water to it. And that's the natural state. And so it's really important that we stand together and fight against this unnatural state that only serves the handful of wealthy. And not just that, but you also have these really atrocious situations where we're creating these plagues on the health of water that are going to last forever. You know, in Montana, there's this one former mine where the water is the pH of stomach acid, and geese land in it and then die. And so now they shoot fireworks and cannons at the geese so that they don't land in this pond and die from this really acidic water. But that water level is rising. And starting very soon, that water is going to be spilling into Silver Bow Creek and eventually the Columbia River. And so you have these really atrocious situations. And so I really applaud the water protectors and the indigenous communities and the people standing up to this poisoning of our landscape, because no amount of regeneration can undo these kinds of things. So it's a two-pronged approach. We need to restore, revitalize, and regenerate landscapes. We also need to stop the destruction of existing healthy landscapes. And when you look at Australia, it's, you know, to have been over there during this past fire season, when people were running to the ocean for cover from the fire because the whole landscape was burning, ash storms rolling through, storms getting so big that the ash from these fires was then creating their own thunderhead cloud systems. They were creating dry lightning strikes around the edges of these fires, lighting new fires before the ashfall even got to these regions. This is the result of the watershed death spiral. And then as soon as all those fires ended, there were these huge flooding rains that then washed all the soil away. None of that water was able to infiltrate into the ground. And so this is the future the whole world is headed to if we don't really change our course now. And to have been there, I mean, it smells like a barbecue everywhere. And it's amazing how quick people begin to accept that as real. You know, in the West, it wasn't in the past that every year there was a fire season where just the air quality is so poor, it's worse than the air quality in Beijing. Now we accept that as normal, but that's only come into the scenario in recent history. And so it's really important for us to understand that, yes, fire has a role on the landscape, but its role is way out of line, and it's from this fundamental dehydration of the water cycle. And in Australia, you have this situation where you have this wonderful tree that fixes all these issues. Australia is this really old landscape that now, because it's being so abused, erosion's a really big problem. The creeks are a really big problem. And so these willows have come in and said, hey, I'm a willing worker. I can fix this. And so they come into these erosion zones and they stabilize them. And not just that, but this willow, it's so full of water, when the fires come into the willow, it actually retards the fire. There's an old railroad poplar from the French that they used to plant along the old steam railroads so that they would extinguish the fires, and they didn't create fires because these trees are so full of water, they actually put out the fire. And so also in Australia, I saw a beautiful example by a wonderful person, Peter Marshall, where they've taken this old gold mine and they've restored it with water landscapes and with forestry. And so whereas everyone around him burned to ashes and the fire actually circled his place for 3 months coming in from different areas, he was able to take these crown fires where the whole crown of the tree is burning and then drop them to ground fires where he was able to put them out with a shovel. And so he didn't burn in that whole time period, and it was because he had rehydrated his landscape and he worked with species that were really working for the health of the landscape. Now in Australia, they've got some ecological literacy problems. And so what they're doing with these willows is there's a campaign to eradicate the willow because it's an invasive species. And so what they actually do is they cut these, they poison them, and they have what's called a biodiversity bonfire, where they cut out all the willows, they pile them up, and then because they've cleared all the habitat, all of the animals and critters move into the piles of willows because that's where they have habitat now, because they removed the habitat of the tree, and then they ignite those piles to burn them. So they literally have a biodiversity bonfire where they cut the biodiversity, they collect the biodiversity, and then they burn it. And this is the government campaign. Now, I love the Aboriginal perspective of these species. You know, they say, you know, if us Aboriginal folk can tolerate all of you white folk on our landscape, you'd think you white folk can tolerate a few white plants. And what it is really is it's a manifestation of our guilt, of our colonial guilt, because we treated the indigenous people around the world so poorly. We abused them so bad. We want to make amends for that by championing the native species, but nature doesn't work that way. Plants are always moving around. Animals are always moving around. There's always migration events, and nature works with whatever resources it has available. And so now we're using all of these poisons to try and make amends for the travesties we did to the indigenous people, and we're degrading our landscape and ourselves in the process. And in Australia, the colonization was so severe, it was actually a geological event. They overgrazed and they abused the landscape so bad that all of that land in the highlands moved down to the lowlands and covered the floodplain. And so here you can see this black, rich alluvial soil, and then it being covered by this very poor, rocky, almost gravelly soil, because it's such an old landscape, such a sensitive landscape. And in colonization, they abused it so severely. But even in this situation, there's amazing things that you can do. And so here is a wonderful little site for a worm farmer, Killebach vermiculture. And what we did is we created this water landscape. We created a system of terraces that help infiltrate the water and give more land to work. And then we created a system of water bodies that store that water and cycle it through. And so here we did our work right before one of the worst droughts on record. And whereas all the farmers were going bust and buying water, he actually still had enough water to keep everything going. And the work that we did really kept the farm alive through this long drought. Then when those rains did come, the land was actually able to absorb and benefit from those rains instead of it just causing flooding and erosion. And so what can you do? Because there's really a lot we can do. And sometimes it's really simple. It could be as simple as just planting a tree and watching all of the life that comes from that tree. Because trees really are the sentinels of life on this planet. They drive so much of those moisture cycles. And so if all you do after this talk is go outside and plant a tree and watch it and observe it, that is a wonderful and beautiful thing. And you're really helping the global scenario. We can also create regions of diversity. Nature doesn't work as monocultures. It works as diversity. And when you have plants that are occupying different root zones, that are using different nutrients, that are fixing and accumulating different nutrients, you can get a much more productive system. And it's also a much more healthy system for the environment. And so this was a really simple garden we did that's really productive. And it looks like a nature strip. It looks like a pollinator paradise because it is. And it takes very little maintenance because the plants are actually doing the work with each other. You can also hold water in any situation where you have. We've created all these runoff surfaces, our homes, our roads. Everything is designed to drain the water away. Where can we collect that water and infiltrate it into the ground? So this is just a small little natural swimming pond that collects the water off of the roof of the house and helps infiltrate it. Or you can create more elaborate networks of water bodies and terraces and really move the water back and forth across your landscape to enhance that infiltration. It's really important. It's not so much about how much water we receive, but about how many times we use it before it leaves. And in the best situations, you can actually take something like this, where this is a spring, this sacred resource that's been in the ground that was drain tiled and drained away so that the farmer could more easily get their equipment through there. Now, if we can find these points, these acupuncture points within the earth where there are these veins, and then we can work to restore those. We're not just holding the water in those water bodies, we're recharging those veins and rehydrating those grounds and those aquifers and re-enlivening other springs. And so this is really the best thing we can do, is find these acupuncture points of the earth and work within them. And so what we're doing is we're creating a Keyway Dam, where we're finding a layer within the ground that's an impermeable layer, some type of clay. And then we're creating a Keyway Dam where we build a clay wedge, essentially, that ties into that clay bottom. And then we leave the rest of the pond open. So this is on the downhill side, clay wedge into clay bottom that then holds that water, infiltrates it into those areas around and uphill. And then as those fill and recharge, it continues downstream. And so this is, really something that we can do that makes a long-term impact. If we do these features right, they should last until the next ice age. This is another example. And so you're really looking for those clay resources, those earthen resources, not using liners, not using clay mats and artificial materials that in the best scenarios only work for 25, 30 years. What we're using is the earthen resources, restructuring and arranging those so that we're using that fossil fuel energy, but in a way that serves us forever. I really look at, we have this huge responsibility in that we have this clean, cheap, not clean, but cheap available energy that enables us to do big work. We're using it all. We're going to burn it anyway. And right now it's all being used for the destruction of the water cycle. It's being used to build those hard draining landscapes. If we use it all on that, it's going to be really hard for future generations to break up all of our concrete with pickaxes. And so I view it as our responsibility to use some of this resource to rebuild the water infrastructure of the earth before we lose it. And so this is what that looks like. And now we've taken this landscape that burned and was full of ash, and now we've created an area that's rehydrated that will really feed the vegetation around it and provide security for this landscape when the next fire season comes. And it doesn't have to be this too. We can do leaky weirs and techniques that just slow the water down and catch the sediment, beaver dam analogs, and things that are simpler but still have a meaningful impact. And the forests are really key to this whole cycle. So to all the people out there working for the conservation of forests, I applaud you. And we really need those long-term sentinels for ourselves and for future generations to understand what the landscape, the true potential that it holds. And you can create these rich, vibrant landscapes like the Krameterhof and create a living example to people of how we all can live in a really meaningful way. And when you work with nature, this is a tree toppling over with its own natural productivity. There's no fertilizers, no inputs into this, no compost teas and extracts. This is just a rich, healthy, vibrant earth, 4 to 5 meters in the ground, full of life, and the tree just feeding off of that productivity. And we can really work to help the health of our waterways, of our rivers, our creeks, and help turn waterways from these straight, channelized, draining to really healthy, sinuous landscapes full of trees, full of abundant life, and full of diversity. So it's really important in this work to develop your mind. Theory can cripple. You have to appreciate the unknown. You have to think ahead and remain dynamic and adaptive. And it's really important to become literate with your landscape, to envision it as it once was rather than what it is today. And in order to manifest your world like these leaders, like Sepp, like Rajinder, you have to have civil courage. You have to be a voice for the voiceless. You have to stand up for what's right for yourself, for your land, for your co-living beings. And you also have to have freedom from attachment. Nature is going to show you the right way, but you can't get too attached to one way or you'll get off the path. And you also have to be relentless, where you really just know in your heart this is right and you know it's what you're going to do. And so we can work with the whole water cycle. We can't look at it as different pieces. They're all interconnected. It starts in the mountains and in the highlands, and then it feeds down through the different waterways. And these trees drive the water into the soil. They also drive the water from the oceans inland. And then you have these fungi serving as this incredibly valuable resource, mineralizing rocks, and providing an immune system for the forest and actually creating water as they respire, creating these rich, spongy habitats that are able to absorb that. You have these diverse prairies, creating rich, deep soils that again enhance that infiltration. You have these waterways, networks of wetlands and estuaries. Anywhere that water is moving and turning, it's becoming oxygenated, and around those rocks, it's being filtered and cleaned by the bacteria, and then it goes out through the mangroves, providing that last filtration before it returns to the ocean. And so this really is the full water cycle. This is the biotic pump. This is life moving water through land, and something that's really important for us to work with, because we don't want any more of the watershed death spiral. We've experienced enough of this, and it's time for us to move in a different direction. So the world is in our hands. It's really our choice how we want to go about this. And it's our choice whether we want a rich, healthy landscape or whether we want to be fighting wars over water. And we're so great at diagnosing and working on the symptoms. And I feel like we're doing this right now with carbon. we're looking at the symptom of the desertification and dehydration of the landscape and looking at that as the problem. But I'm worried we're hitching our cart to the wrong horse, because with carbon, we won't even know if what we're doing is working for 20, 30, 50 years, and the ocean is providing this huge buffer to anything we do. So any of our gains are not going to be experienced within a human timeline. But when you work with water, you experience that the first rainy season. The first rainy season, you see the results of your work and how that's impacted the landscape. It enables people to really get energized and keep working with this. And that's why you can create a community-driven process of rehydrating the ground. And we can go from this desertified land to this new global vision of a new water paradigm. And so that water, it is Earth's blood. All of these complicated things, you can understand them just by drawing that analogy to yourself. And the most fundamental thing is to engage with love and respect for water and nature. If you can every day a little bit more, have a little bit more love in your heart and respect in your actions towards water and nature, we'll get to this better common future that we're trying to achieve. So it's about community-driven, decentralized water retention. And we're creating a platform called waterstories.app, which we hope will be a knowledge point for people to learn this, learn what they can do, engage and practice, and connect with others who want to create the same kind of future. So I'd love for you to check out elementalecosystems.com. This is my business where we do this kind of work around the world. Waterstories.app, where we really would love to hear from you. What do you need to be able to engage in working with water in a meaningful way? And I look forward to answering any of your questions, because it's really, this future is in our hands. It's really up to us and our decision, whether we want to usher in a period of abundance and health, or whether we want to continue down our current trajectory towards a really harsh future. And, having seen that firsthand, I know how powerful it is when you rehydrate landscapes and when you bring life back to areas. It's really something that gives meaning and fulfillment to life.